the worst mutilation of man that can be imagined presented as the good man. Friedrich Nietzsche, the will to power. Imagine a world where strength is seen as a threat, where clarity is mistaken for arrogance, where the man who dares to think for himself is treated as dangerous. You don't need to imagine it, you're already living in it. We have become a civilization that fears everything intense, everything profound, everything that requires courage. Discomfort has become a sin, pain, a medical error, and suffering, a systemic failure. But Nietzsche warned, when a culture begins to protect itself from pain, it is, in fact, protecting itself from life itself. What we call the civilized world is often just a more sophisticated form of collective cowardice, a refusal to face the weight of existence. Strength slowly disappears, not with wars but with concessions. Each generation more comfortable than the last, each individual more dependent on approval, each mind more docile to what is popular. We call this progress, but it is anesthesia, an invisible process of softening of the spirit, where courage is replaced by emotional diplomacy and independence by the search for belonging. People no longer want to be free, they want to be accepted. In the past, suffering shaped character. Today, it's a source of therapy. Chaos once formed heroes. Now, it creates victims. Modern man prides himself on his sensitivity, but he's unable to bear his own reflection when life contradicts him. He trades conviction for likes, truth for comfort, depth for distraction. And amid this silent decline, the question Nietzsche left echoing remains alive. What happens to a man when he loses his taste for struggle? When a people loses their taste for pain, they also lose their instinct for greatness. The entire civilization begins to bow to comfort, mediocrity, and weakness disguised as virtue. Strength is seen as aggression, ambition as selfishness, excellence as arrogance. We live in a complete inversion of values, where brilliance is uncomfortable, success is suspect, and suffering is treated as a moral failing. Nietzsche saw what was coming, an era where the last man, tired of fighting, thirsting for security, would replace the creator, the warrior, the free spirit. A small being, satisfied with little, proud of his own mediocrity. A man who mistakes comfort for happiness, peace for cowardice, and tolerance for virtue. He no longer wants to fly. He just wants not to fall. But there is something Nietzsche also knew. Every decadence generates underground the birth of a new kind of being. When the world bows to fear, the strong man reappears, not as a tyrant, but as a creator. He seeks not to dominate others, but to dominate himself. He does not flee from pain, he transforms it into power. He does not shield himself from chaos, he shapes it. Nietzsche did not write for the common man, he wrote for the unborn, the one who, amidst decay, decides to rebuild himself through his own will. The being who gazes into the abyss and does not retreat. The being who understands that true freedom lies not in escaping suffering, but in giving it meaning. This being is the beginning of something new, the birth of the unbreakable. The death of God and the emptiness of meaning. Nietzsche wrote that God is dead, but what he really meant was never a celebration of atheism. It was a diagnosis, a brutal realization that the symbolic foundation on which the West built its meaning, moral, spiritual, and existential, had crumbled. Modern man killed his own God, and in place of the sacred, he erected nothingness. The phrase is not blasphemy, it is an epitaph. Because when a civilization loses the belief that gave coherence to its pain, it does not free itself, it becomes disoriented. For centuries, God represented the unity of life. It was He who ensured that suffering had a purpose, that virtue had value, and that the moral order was more than a human invention. But when modern man removed God from the center, he also removed the axis of the universe. What remained was emptiness, an existence without reason, without reference, without direction. Nietzsche saw in this emptiness the beginning of the spiritual disease that would corrode European man, nihilism. Not the nihilism that destroys temples, but but the nihilism that inhabits hearts. The nihilism that transforms man into a being who no longer believes in anything, not even himself. Nihilism is silent. It doesn't invade, it dissolves. It doesn't scream, it numbs. And its most devastating consequence is not hopelessness, but indifference. Modern man doesn't suffer from a lack of meaning. He simply distracts himself so as not to notice. He has replaced faith with consumption, purpose with performance, transcendence with entertainment. He no longer believes in truths, only in opinions. He lives surrounded by stimuli, but internally empty. Nietzsche understood that the death of God was a symptom of something deeper, the failure of the spirit of self-improvement. For centuries, man bore the burden of life because he believed it pointed to something beyond himself. Now, without this horizon, he turns to pleasure, comfort, and self-preservation. The absence of God did not liberate him, it enslaved him to his own fear. This is why modern man fears suffering. He no longer sees any meaning in it. But for Nietzsche, suffering has always been the field where the soul is forged. He who has a why can bear almost any how, he wrote. The problem isn't suffering, it's the emptiness of purpose that accompanies it. When there's no why, all pain becomes unbearable. That's why the modern world creates painkillers for everything. Medicines for sadness, distractions for loneliness, ideologies for boredom. Contemporary man doesn't want to live, he wants to be spared. He doesn't seek meaning, he seeks anesthesia. Nietzsche saw this phenomenon not only in individuals, but in entire societies. Civilizations that had lost their creative vigor and were content to preserve what already existed. Cultures that, out of fear of pain, came to idolize stability, security, and equality. But when everything becomes equal, nothing else has value. When everyone wants to avoid suffering, no one grows. The age of nihilism is the age of horizontality, where no one dares to elevate themselves, and those who try are punished for doing so. The symptom is visible everywhere. People who confuse kindness with submission, humility with a lack of ambition, empathy with a fear of confrontation. Modern society has transformed fragility into a virtue and strength into a sin. It is the triumph of mediocrity. The weak no longer wants to win, they want no one to be able to defeat them. And so, they create systems that punish excellence and reward conformity. Nietzsche called this slave morality, an inversion of values where the lofty becomes seen as dangerous and the petty becomes sacred. The humble are called good, the strong evil. The sufferer is exalted, the creator is condemned. It is the morality of resentment, a morality created by those who cannot bear their own impotence and therefore transform their limitations into virtues. This is the true symptom of decadence, when man ceases to admire what surpasses him and begins to hate what reminds him of his own weakness, when greatness disturbs more than it inspires, when life ceases to be a battle for advancement and becomes a contest to see who can suffer with the most style. Nietzsche saw the future and described it with surgical precision. He understood that after the death of God, humanity would seek new idols, not to worship them, but to hide behind them. And thus would be born political religions, superficial moralisms, and philosophies of comfort. Humanity would no longer be guided by faith, but by the desperate need to feel certain. It would seek not the true, but what protects it from uncertainty. And it is in this spiritual desert that the deepest crisis of our time emerges. A generation that believes it knows everything, but can't stand anything. That talks about empathy, but lives in resentment. That demands respect, but doesn't respect itself. A generation that confuses noise with thought and emotion with truth. Nietzsche didn't hate modern man. He simply saw him without illusions. He knew that from time to time, history collapses only to be reborn. That the destruction of the old meaning is the prelude to a new creation. But for this to happen, a select few must refuse to dissolve into mediocrity. There must emerge someone who faces the void and decides to fill it not with faith, but with strength. Because after the death of God, there is only one alternative. Either man destroys himself in nihilism, or he recreates himself in the will to power. The cult of weakness and slave morality. Nietzsche believed that every civilization carries within itself a silent battle, the struggle between the morality of the strong and the morality of the weak. The former arises from the affirmation of life, the latter from resentment. The morality of the strong is creative. It celebrates vitality, courage, and the ability to bear the weight of existence. The morality of the weak, on the other hand, is reactive. It creates nothing, merely inverts the value of what it fears. When unable to be strong, the weak man changes the meaning of strength. When unable to win, he redefines victory. And thus, resentment, this envy disguised as virtue, becomes the moral foundation of an entire era. For Nietzsche, historical Christianity was the most sophisticated example of this inversion. He observed that, instead of confronting suffering, humanity began to sanctify it. Pain ceased to be a test of life and became a spiritual merit. Humility, once a state of recognition of reality, was transformed into a symbol of moral purity. Renunciation became an ideal, instinct was demonized, and vitality was suspect. Slave morality is, therefore, a revolt against life, a system created by the weak to protect themselves from greatness. But this morality didn't die with religion, it simply changed its face. Today, it disguises itself in discourses of equality, empathy, and unconditional acceptance. Beautiful words, but they often hide the same logic of denying strength. Modern culture has learned to praise fragility and distrust power. Self-confidence is treated as arrogance, ambition as selfishness, self-control as emotional rigidity. Everything that evokes greatness is diluted in an aesthetic of vulnerability, where suffering becomes identity and weakness a public virtue. This inversion of values is so profound that we no longer perceive it. Today, the weak man not only survives, he is celebrated. Society holds him up as a moral model, while anyone who dares to seek power, discipline, or self-control is seen as threatening. We live in a culture that idolizes the defeated, glorifies failure, and turns impotence into a banner. It is the triumph of resentment over admiration. Success has ceased to be an inspiration and has become an insult. What is admired now is pain, as long as it doesn't generate overcoming, only self-pity. Nietzsche saw this as the inevitable result of a humanity that had forgotten the value of struggle. He called this phenomenon resentment, the emotion that defines the spirit of the weak. The resentful cannot create, so they criticize. They cannot win, so they condemn the victor. They cannot admire, so they despise. The resentful live on denial, the pleasure of seeing others fall, the satisfaction of leveling down, the false moral superiority of those who confuse kindness with impotence. This is the human type who needs injustice to feel righteous, oppressors to feel pure, guilt to feel holy. Slave morality is, at its core, a form of emotional self-protection. It says, if I can't be great, then greatness is evil. Thus, the weak absolve themselves. It's not that they can't fight, it's that fighting would be wrong. It's not that they lack ambition, it's that ambition is ugly. They transform their limitations into moral merits. And the modern world, saturated with comfort and fear of conflict, accepts this logic with enthusiasm. Today, people no longer want to improve. They want to be understood. They don't want to evolve. They want to be validated. Suffering is no longer something to be overcome. It has become something to be displayed. Nietzsche viewed this transformation of suffering into a spectacle with horror. Because where suffering is celebrated, strength is suppressed. When pain becomes identity, it loses its power to transform. And this is how modern man becomes trapped in endless cycles of victimization, unable to shape his own destiny. The culture of resentment not only destroys the individual, it destroys the very notion of merit. Because deep down, it teaches that it is easier to destroy the strong than to become strong. But resentment has another, more profound effect. It dissolves the sense of truth. For the weak man, what is true is what makes him feel good. What challenges him, he calls oppression. What demands him, he calls abuse. What forces him to grow, he calls violence. The world begins to revolve around his sensitivity, and all criticism is perceived as an attack. It is the triumph of the wounded ego over reality. The result is a society where no one wants to be corrected, only comforted. Where there is no longer greatness, only uncontrolled emotions masquerading as morality. Nietzsche called this era the twilight of idols, the moment when values lose their meaning because everyone is worth the same. Kindness without strength is impotent. Compassion without discernment is blind. Equality without merit is decadence. When society begins to protect everyone from everything, it destroys everyone's ability to endure anything. And so, slowly, it creates a humanity incapable of pain, but also incapable of depth. Slave morality doesn't just level, it corrodes. Because by denying the natural hierarchy of life, it kills the spirit of ascension. And without ascension, there is no creation. A man who lives resentful doesn't build cathedrals. He builds complaints. He doesn't create works. He creates excuses. He doesn't build bridges. He builds walls. And when all men become equal, no one has any reason to improve. Nietzsche knew that slave morality would triumph because it offers what modern man desires most: relief from responsibility. Being strong requires choosing, requires losing, requires enduring. Being weak, on the contrary, allows one to blame the world for everything. It's comfortable, predictable, popular, but it's also the surest path to the emptying of the soul. And this is where the transition begins, the point at which Nietzsche stops diagnosing and begins to propose a remedy. If the morality of the weak is a reaction to suffering, the antidote is the will to power, the ability to transform suffering into creation, pain into strength, and chaos into meaning. Humanity's next step, according to him, would not be spiritual, but ontological. The birth of a type of human being capable of affirming life, even when it hurts. Because strength isn't the absence of pain. It's the ability to look at it and say, "Still, I choose to live." The collapse, the reversal of values. There comes a time in the history of every civilization when the virtues that built it become the instruments of its own downfall. When what was once noble becomes seen as oppressive. When what once demanded discipline becomes called inhumane. And when what once represented greatness is reinterpreted as arrogance. Nietzsche called this revaluation of all values, the inversion of all values. The point at which the human spirit ceases to affirm life and begins to justify its own weakness. The moral collapse of the West, according to Nietzsche, did not begin with wars or revolutions, but with an inner gesture, the abandonment of the spiritual hierarchy. When truth ceases to be something to be conquered and becomes something to be felt. When man prefers security to freedom, approval to authenticity, compassion to justice. It is an invisible, slow, almost merciful, but lethal process. Because when all values are leveled, good and evil lose their shape, and man no longer knows what to admire or despise. Nietzsche observed that this movement of reversal arises from collective resentment. The masses, unable to bear the sight of the strong, the creators, and the free spirits, reinterpret strength as evil and weakness as virtue. Thus, the instinct for greatness is demonized, while submission is canonized. Courage is labeled aggression, lucidity as coldness, the will to power as tyranny. The result is a culture that destroys what is highest in man, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear is the great architect of collapse. Fear of feeling pain, fear of being rejected, fear of being different, fear of being hated. Modern man has become so sensitive to suffering that he has begun to eliminate any experience that might remind him of his own vulnerability. He no longer wants truth, he wants relief. He no longer wants to understand the world. He wants to protect himself from it. And so, slowly, civilization becomes an incubator of emotional, intellectual, and spiritual fragility. Nietzsche predicted that when the will to power was replaced by the will to comfort, man would transform into what he called the last man, a domesticated being incapable of enduring the tragedy of existence. A man who no longer seeks the high but the stable, who no longer dreams of eternity, only of longevity, who no longer desires to be free, only protected. He lives to avoid suffering, and in doing so, he forgoes living fully. The last man is the end product of this inversion of values. He is educated to believe that all pain is injustice, all conflict is violence, all hierarchy is oppression. He claims to be compassionate, but his compassion is cowardice. He speaks of equality, but his equality is a leveling down. He preaches tolerance, but his tolerance is an escape from the truth. He is, deep down, the man who has given up on being. This man dominates the modern world. He fills universities, social media, governments, and corporations. He speaks in the name of morality, but is driven by resentment. He masquerades as a humanist, but hates everything that reminds him of his own mediocrity. Therefore, he destroys the old idols, not to replace them with new ones, but to ensure that no man ever again feels small in the face of greatness. He wants a world without mirrors, where no one shines brighter than anyone else, where mediocrity is the universal rule and excellence a spiritual crime. Nietzsche saw this phenomenon as the most dangerous form of decadence, that which disguises itself as goodness. Because while evil is self-aware, the resentful good believe they are saving the world, and so, in the name of compassion, they eliminate demands. In the name of inclusion, they destroy meritocracy. In the name of peace, they castrate courage. They confuse gentleness with virtue and strength with violence. This is the essence of the reversal. The world begins to revolve around the fragile. The virtues that create civilizations, discipline, hierarchy, sacrifice, courage, are replaced by slogans of sensitivity and pleasure. People stop asking, "What is true?" and start asking, "What makes me feel good?" Truth, duty, and ideal become obsolete. Modern man no longer wants to conquer life. He just wants to be spared it. And the cruelest thing is that this decline doesn't destroy the body. It destroys the spirit. We've never had so much technology, so much comfort, so much information. And yet, we've never been so fragile, so insecure, so morally confused. We live surrounded by noble words, empathy, acceptance, diversity, but empty of meaning, because they're used as shields to avoid the effort of thinking and acting. Nietzsche called this the death of the tragic spirit, the extinction of the human capacity to look at suffering and say, yes. The tragic spirit does not flee from pain. It transforms it into art, into wisdom, into overcoming. But the modern era has fled the tragic and taken refuge in the therapeutic. What was once a challenge has become trauma. What was once an obstacle has become oppression. What was once discipline has become rigidity. We have lost the muscle of the soul. The inevitable consequence is the collapse of all hierarchy, moral, intellectual, and spiritual. When no one believes in objective values anymore, everything becomes opinion. When everything is relative, the only remaining criterion is emotional. And when emotions govern thought, truth becomes hostage to collective sensitivity. The result is predictable. A society where the hysterical are listened to more than the wise, where the impulsive dominate the patient, and where noise replaces thought. Nietzsche didn't see this collapse as the end, but as a purification. For him, the destruction of inherited values was necessary, but only to make room for new creators. The problem is that most people aren't ready for this. Most don't want to create new values. They want to hide under the ruins of the old ones. And this is where nihilism becomes dangerous, when it ceases to be a transition and becomes a place of residence. The collapse of values is not the end of humanity. It is the test of who deserves to continue. Those who survive the death of the old gods are not the most comfortable, but the strongest. Those who can live without guarantees, without manuals, without promises of salvation. Those who look into the void and say, "I will become my own foundation." It is in this abyss that Nietzsche sees the birth of a new human type, the spirit that does not flee from pain, but transforms it into meaning, the being that no longer depends on the approval of the world, because it is self-sufficient, the one who, faced with the collapse of all values, has the courage to create their own. This is the beginning of overcoming, because only when everything collapses does man discover what truly sustains him. And it is at this point of total darkness that the spark of rebirth begins. The will to power, the creative force that emerges when man finally understands that, to rise, he must first die as what the world taught him to be. Philosophy as an antidote. Nietzsche believed that the cure for nihilism would not be found in new beliefs, but in new people. No doctrine, no political system, no religion could restore meaning to modern life, because meaning is not something inherited, it is something created. The antidote to decadence, he said, is not hope, but strength, not faith in something external, but the inner will that transforms chaos into form. And it is here that the most powerful and most misunderstood idea in his entire philosophy is born: will to power. For Nietzsche, everything that lives, lives because it wants to expand, assert itself, surpass itself. Life is not driven by the pursuit of happiness, but by the impulse to grow, even if it brings pain. This force that pushes each being beyond itself is will to power. It is not a thirst for domination, as so many have interpreted it, but the creative impulse that transforms limitation into form, pain into wisdom, solitude into freedom. The strong man is not the one who subjugates others, but the one who dominates himself. The will to power is, above all, self-mastery, the art of transforming one's own vulnerability into power. The decadent man flees from pain, the strong man embraces it. The weak seek relief, the strong seek transformation. The former tries to extinguish the fire of existence, the latter learns to burn without being destroyed. This is the difference between the common man and the superman, the overman. It is not a superior physical or biological being, but a spirit that transcends the limitations inherited from the morality of the weak. The superman is the one who, faced with the death of God and the collapse of all values, chooses to create new ones and live as if it were his own law. Nietzsche saw philosophy not as a collection of ideas, but as an exercise in strength. Thinking for him was an act of courage, because thinking is to shatter illusions, to break with what is comfortable, to gaze into the abyss of existence without anesthesia. Philosophy, when it is true, does not console, it provokes. It does not protect man from suffering, it teaches him how to use it. It is the art of transforming despair into structure, chaos into form, tragedy into creation. The true philosopher, Nietzsche said, is the physician of civilization. He diagnoses the disease of the modern soul, cowardice, conformity, resentment, and proposes a radical treatment, a return to inner greatness. He offers not medicines to eliminate pain, but tools to endure it. Because pain is not a defect in life, it is its price. The man who seeks to live without pain also seeks to live without depth. For Nietzsche, philosophy is the highest form of asceticism, not the negation of life, but its intensification. It forces us to ask, what can I create from what I have suffered? What can I build with what I have lost? What can I transform with what has destroyed me? The person who becomes a philosopher of himself stops seeking salvation outside and begins to carve his own destiny. The will to power is this inner movement that replaces faith with responsibility. Modern man seeks redemption. The strong man seeks reconstruction. One wants to be saved. The other wants to become worthy of his own existence. Therefore, Nietzsche says that the truly free spirit is one who has learned to love fate, amor fati, love what is, love even pain, error, failure, and chance. Don't resign yourself to them, but accept them as an inseparable part of the totality of life. Do not seek to change the world, Nietzsche would say. Become so strong that the world does not destroy you. The man who practices amor fati, he doesn't run from suffering, he embodies it. He understands that tragedy is the price of consciousness, and that greatness is born only from what the world tries to erase. When everything external falls away, what remains is inner strength, and it only grows through resistance. This philosophy is not an intellectual luxury, but a spiritual necessity. It is what separates the man who dissolves in time from the one who transcends it, because at its core, every authentic philosophy is a form of survival, not physical, but moral. The man who thinks deeply not only understands the world, he creates an axis within himself that makes him unshakable. This is why Nietzsche said that the superior man is the one who can live without guarantees. He has no need for heaven, for promises, for applause. He lives according to an inner law, and this makes him free from any prison. Philosophy as an antidote is the refusal to be numb. It is the return to the courage to think, to feel, to endure. It is the conscious choice to say yes to life, not only to its beautiful aspects, but also to its wounds. Nietzsche didn't want to create followers. He wanted to create creators. Men and women capable of looking at nothingness and saying, "I fill it with what I am." This is the quiet revolution he envisioned, not political, not religious, but ontological. A rebirth of the spirit that replaces fear with force, guilt with creation, blind faith with the conscious affirmation of life. Because, in the end, Nietzsche's philosophy is not about understanding the world. It is about making it bearable enough to be loved. And loving life, even when it tears itself apart, is the most powerful gesture a human being can make. It is the sign that the disease of nihilism has been cured. For he who can look at suffering and still say yes to existence, that for Nietzsche is the truly free man. The man who, amid the world's decay, has become his own antidote. The joy of suffering and the circle of power. Nietzsche believed that suffering was not the opposite of joy, it was its condition. All deep pain, when borne consciously, transforms into power. And all true power arises from pain that has been understood, metabolized, and integrated. This is the logic of eternal return. The idea that everything we experience, including suffering, should be affirmed as if we would choose it again, over and over again. Not as punishment, but as an exercise in spiritual strength. The weak man wants to escape pain. The strong man wants to understand it. The former sees suffering as an injustice, the latter an initiation. Because life, in its essence, does not seek comfort. It seeks intensity. Pain is the price of expansion. Where there is growth, there is friction. Where there is creation, there is destruction. Nietzsche saw in this a cosmic law. Every force that rises must overcome the resistance of the world. There is no power without friction, no transcendence without collapse. Suffering is the soul's training ground. It is there that man discovers his own structure. Every loss tests him, every humiliation reveals him, every obstacle purifies him. The weak flee, the strong remain, and in remaining they discover something no one else understands, that there is a form of joy hidden in the midst of pain, a joy without laughter, without promises, without guarantees, tragic joy. Nietzsche said that only the strongest spirits can bear the truth, that life has no purpose beyond the affirmation of life itself. There is no ultimate meaning, no divine plan, no ultimate justice. There is only the flow of existence, birth, growth, loss, beginning again. For the weak, this is despair. For the strong, it is liberation. The weak must believe that everything happens for a reason. The strong create the reason at every moment. This is the difference between the nihilist and the creator. The nihilist sees suffering as proof that life is cruel. The creator sees it as proof that he is alive. He understands that suffering is the universe's way of forcing him to grow, that all pain brings a choice, to complain, or to be reborn. And each time he chooses to be reborn, he approaches the circle of power, the state of consciousness, where man no longer fights against life, but with it. In this circle, there is no longer a separation between good and evil, between pleasure and pain. Everything is incorporated, everything is affirmed. The person who enters this circle does not seek to eliminate suffering. He transforms it into fuel. He does not seek to dominate the world, but himself. And when this happens, suffering ceases to be an enemy and becomes an ally. Pain is no longer a burden, it is a tool. Nietzsche saw suffering as the highest form of pedagogy of existence. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger isn't a motivational phrase, it's a spiritual law. Pain is the process by which the being refines itself. It's the fire that separates gold from impurities. It's the abyss that forces man to discover his own wings. The weak fear fire because it burns. The strong seek it because it purifies. He understands that the soul that has never suffered has also never awakened. There is a joy reserved only for those who have gone through hell. A joy that is independent of circumstances, because it arises from mastery over them. It is the serenity of the warrior who no longer expects rewards, but rejoices in the fight. It is the tranquility of those who no longer need to flee from pain, because they have learned to inhabit it. This state is the opposite of despair. It is fulfillment, the awareness that each wound carries within it the seed of the strength to come. Nietzsche said that man must learn to dance with his own suffering, not as one who denies it, but as one who embodies it. Dance is a metaphor for the lightness that arises from understanding. The man who learns to dance with pain is no longer its slave, he transforms it into rhythm. It is at this point that strength ceases to be mere resistance and becomes art. The tragic spirit, the one who can love fate, amor fati, is what has reached supreme maturity, that of saying yes to life in all its forms. The circle of power is, therefore, the closure of Nietzsche's philosophy. A circle because everything life takes away, it returns in another form. Everything it destroys, it also renews. Whoever understands this stops seeking escape and begins to seek form. Pain ceases to be an event and becomes a language, the way the universe communicates growth. Suffering is no longer punishment, but cosmic discipline. When man accepts this cycle, he ceases to be a victim of existence and becomes its collaborator. He doesn't demand that life be fair. He only demands that he be strong enough to love it. This is the joy of suffering, knowing that each blow is an opportunity to become deeper, that each fall is a chance to build new muscles of the soul, that each disappointment is a new initiation into the mystery of strength. And it is at this point that man reaches his ultimate form. He becomes that which nothing can break, not because he is invulnerable, but because he no longer fears being hurt. He knows that pain will come, but he also knows that nothing in it is definitive, that everything returns, everything transforms, everything serves. Suffering ceases to be the opposite of happiness and becomes its foundation. The man who understands this lives in a state of silent power. He does not agitate, does not complain, does not demand. He observes, acts, creates. His joy is subterranean. He does not shout, does not display, does not need validation. It is the joy of one who has gained control of his own soul. And when man reaches this point, Nietzsche would say, he has finally fulfilled life's destiny, to affirm the world as it is, and yet smile. Because ultimate power isn't ruling the world, it's loving the world even when it hurts. The antidote to collective mediocrity. Nietzsche believed that humanity's future would depend on the few, those who, amid moral confusion and the collapse of meaning, chose not only to survive, but to rise. These few would be the new architects of the spirit, not leaders in the political sense, but men and women who reject the comfort of the masses and rediscover the instinct for greatness. In a world that fears pain, venerates security, and rewards passivity, the greatest act of rebellion is to become strong. The antidote to collective mediocrity lies not in changing the system, but in transforming the individual. because every system is merely a reflection of the human soul. A culture of weakness only exists because individuals have given up on being strong. When courage disappears from within, external tyranny is born. When the will to power is repressed, ideologies emerge that promise redemption without effort, virtue without sacrifice, valor without pain. And every time humanity believes in these promises, it becomes lesser. Nietzsche didn't preach the destruction of morality, he preached its overcoming. His philosophy is a call for man to stop behaving like a patient awaiting a cure and become the physician of his own soul. This requires something the modern world has unlearned: inner discipline, detachment from approval, and a love of difficulty. The man who seeks comfort will live at the mercy of others. The man who seeks power builds an internal axis that nothing can move. True human rebirth begins when the individual decides to stop running from themselves, when they understand that loneliness is not the absence of companionship, but the presence of themselves. When they understand that pain is not punishment, but the soil where strength grows. When they realize that chaos is not an enemy, but raw material for creation. Mediocrity only flourishes where there is anesthesia, and anesthesia only thrives where people refuse the responsibility of becoming the author of their own lives. Nietzsche believed that modern man had lost the sense of tragedy, that ability to look at suffering and still say, yes. Civilization can only be reborn when it regains this courage, when it once again sees error as a path, failure as a teacher, pain as language. Because what distinguishes the superior man is not how much he suffers, but what he does with it. The Superman, the man who rises, is not the one born with privileges or special gifts. He is the one who, in the face of decline, chooses not to bow, who creates new values where everyone merely repeats, who acts with purpose where everyone seeks distraction, who thinks clearly where everyone reacts with emotion. He is the living antidote to nihilism, not because he believes in something, but because he has become something. This is the challenge Nietzsche poses to each of us, not to seek the comfort of belonging, but the pride of being, not to wait for the world to change, but to become the kind of man who changes the world by his mere presence. In a time when everyone wants to be understood, the strong man wants to be transformed. In a time when everyone wants recognition, he seeks self-mastery. In a time when everyone runs from pain, he uses it as a mirror. The antidote to collective mediocrity is a return to the will to power. It's the refusal to live numb. It's the silent act of raising one's spirit when the whole world calls one mad. It's becoming, little by little, one who no longer needs applause, pity, or moral crutches to exist. The unbreakable man is the one who understands what Nietzsche meant with his most brutal and liberating phrase: become who you are. Because in the end, the great tragedy is not suffering, it is the forgetting of strength. And true salvation does not come from outside, but from the moment in which man looks at himself, faces the abyss, and decides to create meaning where the world only offers him emptiness. This is the beginning of overcoming. This is the birth of the unbreakable being.